So,
Oh, it's in the office.
okay.
Oh, definitely, I didn't know it was on the committee actually. You want to sit here next to you?
Oh, if you
Or you
don't
want to
mind.
roll the tweet your phone?
You're my friend too. Doesn't matter.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the subcommittee for HB 354. And just so everybody's aware where we're going, there are a number of reasons why HB 354 was retained. One, yes, it's a charter school bill where school building aid would be directed towards the construction and eligibility of those schools to receive state dollars. But two, we are also very, very concerned after we have gone through the process of other bills this year dealing with school building aid, when we're seeing there's some level of dissatisfaction in regard to the funding formula for school building aid within this state and within this legislature. And by that I mean there was a draft amendment proposed by a legislator to fund school building aid based upon a per capita amount each year. And that drew a number of issues and concerns. The per capita costs like that, one would take some school districts based upon how many years do we talk about, Amy? About 90 to 100 years before they'd have enough money for a schoolhouse. But two, it also provided money to school districts like Albany that don't have schools. And there would be no need for school construction dollars. So there were a lot of issues there. And so we're going to have to tackle both of these issues. And while we're talking about the bill itself, we also then are going to be going way beyond in terms of that whole chapter of law in terms with school building aid. And as you know, there's a limited number of schools which receive charter building aid each year. And of course, it's capped also at up to $50 million. And we'll get into it, that's obviously not covering what our needs are in the state right now. And so with that, many districts that see themselves way down that list are saying, I'm never going to see school building aid dollars. So why should I vote for this bill? And so, or any bill on that, seeing it's going to be so delayed that it's not going to ever really, be productive for my particular community. So with that, I'd like to get on with it today. We have Representative Mooney's here, and she is the prime sponsor of 354. We also have Amy Clark from the Department of Education, which when I talked with Amy, she was willing to give us an overview of where we are with school building aid and on some ideas too, as maybe concepts that we should be thinking about and where we're going and where we might go with a formula which there are a lot of issues, and we'll see some of those addressed today. So I'm going to start off for about 5 or 10 minutes. Maureen, can you give a brief overview of your bill just for a short time, and then we're going to get into the DOE and then get on to our discussion. Okay, thank you.
The gentleman filling out a pink card, he doesn't really need to fill out a
There are no need for pink cards today because it's not a hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Representative Maureen Mooney. I represent the town of Merrimack, that's Hillsborough County District 12. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to thoroughly discuss and review this bill. I'm the prime sponsor on House Bill 354. I'll keep my comments brief, but I do want to do three things. I want to give you a long-term history, a short-term history, and then review what the bill does in two parts. So let's start with the long term. Last term, I introduced a very similar bill to this one, and it was to allow public charter schools to apply in the process for school building aid. Doesn't mean get it, it means apply. There were several questions with that bill last term with regards to who owns the building and what would happen, so on and so forth. So I took that and worked with others to craft language which brings me to the short term. I introduced then House Bill 354, which incorporates answers to questions of who owns the building, and this being limited to only those charter schools that own their own buildings. Now, House Bill 354 was retained in this committee this past year, but also, I'll have you know this, in House Finance, I introduced this exact bill, word for word, as an amendment to House Bill 2. House Finance Committee adopted this exact language to House Bill 2 with a vote of 25-0. House Bill 2 then went from House Finance to the floor of the House, and as you know, it passed through the floor of the House on a voice vote. The language then was then removed in Senate Finance Committee. Why? I don't know. House Bill 2 then adopted, as we know, just last Thursday, and this has been excluded. So that then leads me to the content of this bill. It does, in my opinion, two things. First, and I'd like to give a handout if I could to clarify this point. It clears up a very obvious contradiction currently in New Hampshire law. I've created this handout. Currently in RSA 194-B:11, Roman 7, very clear, no school building aid shall be awarded to public charter schools. Clear. Then in 198:15-B, the amount of the grant to any chartered public school established in accordance with RSA 194-B3 shall be 30% of the eligible cost of construction. I go back to a bill that was introduced in House Finance this past year, and it was to fund a position at the Department of Education for an attorney to go through the education statutes specifically and recodify them and find contradictions. When the Department of Education introduced that bill to House Finance, they used this as the example for why the position was needed and why there are discrepancies and controversies and contradictions and cleanups needed in the education statutes. This bill, House Bill 354, would clean it up. It would remove where it says charter schools cannot receive building aid. It would keep the 30%. Part B of what this bill does, again, I go back to, it simply allows public chartered schools in New Hampshire that own their own buildings to apply and go through the process like any other public school in New Hampshire for school building aid. So that would require review by the Department of Education, warrant articles, the whole 9 yards there, which can be articulated best by Amy Clark and those from the Department of Ed that are here. Simply would allow public charter schools, again, that own their own buildings to apply. Whether or not they get it, that's up to the process. This bill would allow them to apply. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I've given you the history of the bill from last term, the most recent history of the bill, including it coming out of Finance 25-0 and being attached to the House version of House Bill 2, only to be scraped by the Senate. And then here we are today and what the bill would do. I do have people here from the Department of Education and from the charter school community that would also like to speak, I'm sure, and answer questions if you have them. And with that, I will conclude my testimony, and thank you again, all of you, for your time.
Thank you very much. Is there a need for any further information from Representative Mooney? No, thank you. So what I'd like to do then now is that with 354, we know that this was taken out of HB2. So we're right now where we were at the beginning of this year without building aid going to the charter schools. Now, there's also the issue that we had with several other bills dealing with that we had requested funding that would support some of the needs for public schools. And we, again, are been limited there too as well. So what I'd like to do is take a moment right now and invite Amy Clark up to try and walk us through a little bit of information, but go ahead and set up, Amy. I want to also explain what is in your packet of materials that you've received here. You have, of course, a copy of 354. That should be right the first on the list there. Then there was this sheet which identified HB2 building aid considerations. And I'm going to just allude to this very quickly here. On the bottom of that sheet, this looks like there's a table up there. I don't want you looking at the table itself. I want to look at the bottom of that sheet and going on to the next sheet. There's issues needing resolution here with the current formula and that which was proposed by the representative to do it on a per pupil basis. One of the things that this committee's got to resolve here, is there a way to fund smaller projects alongside the larger ones? We have a number of projects that come in which are asking for much lesser money than the big $80 million projects or the $20 million projects. These might be projects $3 million or less to renovate a schoolhouse, primarily a lot of the smaller K through 8 districts. Then we also have questions which are on our considerations on the second side. How do charters fit into the process? We just heard this. And we have to be looking at, are we going to be funding at 30%? We fund from 30% to 60% based upon medium income families and property valuations. What about emergency projects? There's another issue which we have to be cognizant of. Should building aid pay for career technical education space that's used within a high school situation? Do security and safety issues need to rise to the top of our formula? We do have the infrastructure fund, but that's not addressing some of the issues that would come under play here with some of the other safety type issues within the buildings. Access, like, do you have access to the second floor of your building? Believe it or not, we've had within just the last year or so, one building, a project went out to just afford a person in a wheelchair to get into the school, more or less to the second floor of the school in Rumney to get up to where his or her student was receiving an education. Going on down, we did look at this. Should charitable trusts, bequests, gifts, insurance policies be subtracted from the state grant? That was an issue that was brought up by Representative Cascadden here and those folks from and Superintendent Taylor up in Cobra. Going on further down, in regard to new construction, offset state share of building grant by sale of any assets, building property from previous facility. Should the sale of the property offset what they get from the grant consideration or the sale or the lease? Studying methods of ensuring long-term sustainability funding for school buildings and identify sources of such funds. Sustainability is very important, but even more so, where do these funds come from? We have tried for years to have more than $50 million per year allocated to schools. Even put in bills say no less than $50 million. Every time we've done that, we've met a brick wall. Alrighty, going on down, should state share of grant be flat funded? Consider community wealth, but flat funded, but do we also consider some variables like community wealth, income levels, levels of grades in the school, geographic location, demographics of the school itself? Should 80% be provided immediately upon, in the formula right now, you get a grant, 80% of the state share comes to you right out of the blocks. It used not to be like that. We put it at 80% so that we could reduce the interest costs of the local school district. They used to get it incrementally over the period duration of that loan. Or should it be reduced so it's spread over the life of the bond? If you did that, you could probably fund a few more projects each year, but then you run the risk of going closer to a tail again. More debt, which we had $540 million debt when I first came on board here in school building aid alone. Assess eligibility criteria based upon need. And we want to look at other state funding models. We had a researcher back at the table there. I did briefly one day, and she came in and presented several other types of plans which were going in the state of Kentucky and the state of Virginia. We want to look at that too. And lastly, what is the state condition of our buildings right now? We've never been able, other than the surveys put out by DOE, to ascertain what you think you have there behind that wall, whether you think there's asbestos there or not. And the custodian might say, yeah, well, we got it, and there may not be anything there. So we need to really ascertain what is out there as far as the buildings in terms of the same assessment for every schoolhouse in this state. So we have some consistent criteria so we can start projecting in the cost for our 10-year plan, which we've fought so hard to do. So that's where we are with some of the issues which we have to attack and try to address here right now before we talk to Amy. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's another issue that beyond this list, and that is didn't we retain a bill that dealt with the dissolution of charter schools and how that should be done? It would seem to me that that also is a related issue here, because if charter schools are in fact going to begin getting money, and they should ultimately then and put that into a building and ultimately dissolve, as we have, I think we've had like 5 or 6 of our charter schools have dissolved. What is the relationship of the money that goes into that charter school from the state as far as building goes? What happens to that? Who's responsible for it? Where's the money come from? Where's the asset and the growth of that asset? What happens to it? So that, I think, Rick, that's a related issue here.
Yes, definitely. And the charter schools, when we look at building aid for the charter schools, all this comes into play. And as we read parts of the law, if a charter school does dissolve, then who ends up having to pay that burden for the debt that district may have, the district?
And also the value of that asset.
So there's a lot to this.
Oh, yeah,
And so we're going to have to really engage and work hard on this from the charter school perspective and from the perspective of aid to all public schools. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Amy. If you can give us a brief background of where we are on all this, it'd be appreciated.
Sure. So I know I've met all of you several times at this point, but again, my name is Amy Clark, and I work for the Department of Education in the Bureau of School Facilities. Building aid falls under my bureau as well. And so I'm happy to go over the summary that's in your packet if you feel that it's helpful, and kind of just give you a step 1 through building aid. But I also don't want to, if you all feel like you're experts and you're good to go, but I also know you hear from a lot of Department of Education, so I'm happy to do that overview again. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think it would be,
Can do a
some of the
shorter
things you might
version?
want to hit on is the 30 to the 60% and some of the criteria you're using in awarding these grants out.
Sure. And I believe that's in your packet. So Representative Ladd just went over that list. I think the next is House Bill 2. Looks like there's some research, and then it gets to this page, which is just the cover sheet. So if you get to that page, that's where I'm going to kind of start. That's a copy of the summary that I typically give. And so the following page, so that's just like what's in this packet. That's a table of contents page with my contact information if you ever need me. So I'm gonna really spend time on this page. Mine is color copied. I don't think yours is, but it has a table at the bottom. So essentially, building aid RSA 195.15, we have rules that support it under ED 321, and the basics really are building aid is just the state portion of a large construction project. What it's not, you already mentioned CTE, no, it's not, we don't, well, it's separate from the CTE funding program, which a lot of people know about. It is not public school infrastructure fund money. So when you hear about security grants and things like that, that's also not building aid. There's another portion, lease aid falls under 198.15, and that's lease grants to charter schools to help pay for the lease payments. That's under RSA 198.15, but that is also not building aid. Building aid is really for large construction projects. Representative Mooney mentioned that there is in building aid right now. Charter schools are eligible through 198.15, but are prohibited through 194B from applying. So just to echo what she said, that to be honest, when I started, I was only in charge of 198.15 rules, and charter school called me within the first year, and I was like, yeah, fill out an application. So, so it was news to me a little later on that they were not eligible. I apologized, and we didn't end up getting any money anyway. So, through building aid ranges, the building aid rate for the state's portion of this large construction project is 30 to 60%. It's not a linear formula, meaning the average isn't between those numbers. It's heavily weighted to the 30% end. The average rate for schools is 38% in using that formula. And as you can imagine, more affluent communities are at the 30% range, less affluent are at the 60% range. There's not a ton of schools at that 60%. The funding source is the Education Trust Fund and remains the Education Trust Fund. Didn't have to make an edit there. The history of building aid, the quick history of building aid is it has been around since the 40s, the 1940s, and has been given reliably to all construction projects for public schools all the way up through 2009. So I just want to say that one more time, because I think it's important to remember that at one time, the state paid for a portion, 30 to 60%. The formula has changed over the years, but it's been 30 to 60% of any public school construction project. Even things that are now not eligible were eligible prior to 2009. What was eligible were SAU offices. That's no longer eligible. What was eligible would be if a school wanted to replace all their windows or do a roof replacement, that was eligible, and those are no longer eligible. So just keep in mind that that's the kind of the history that it's been there. The law changed in so essentially what happened, I'm going to go down to this table in the green here. You don't have the color copy, sorry. The table below. Essentially, from 1946 to 2009, that 63-year period, money was appropriated to meet demand. So the applications would come to the department would report to the legislature how much money was being asked for, and then that money was appropriated. A few times there was a shortfall, and we would short all the schools the same rate. So maybe the state was short 5%, and we would cut those awards across the board by 5%. A few years there were shortfalls, but not many that I'm aware of. From 2010 to 2019, so the following 10-year period, there was a 2-year moratorium that was put in place. So a 2-year moratorium started in 2010, and schools, what I think just to kind of think about as a person from a school, what they thought was 2 years, because I think this is really important. They thought 2 years, it's a temporary moratorium, will come out of moratorium. Who is going to build during that two years when they know the grant program is going to be opened up in 2 years later when they could get state aid? So that 2 years, I can pretty much assure you there was no construction going on. 2 years later, the moratorium was again added for another 2 years. So schools have been in this, oh no, just wait 2 more years. It's not like schools knew that there was a 10-year moratorium. So I think maybe around year 8, people were kind of having a hint that maybe building aid was struggling a little bit. And I think a few schools went on to build without state aid. We know Oyster River just built a beautiful school. There's a few others out there that built schools without state aid. But during that 10-year period, not a lot of schools built with state aid. Certainly not struggling communities built during that time. There was one project that was funded through House Bill 2 amended, lifted the moratorium to allow this one project to be funded. That was Hinsdale. They had some kind of emergency situation. It was a $3.6 million project. The state aid portion was $2.2 million. So other than that one project, there was a 10 years without building aid. And then for the first time, the budget from 20 to 21, that biennium budget was the first time it was lifted. Building aid, the moratorium disappeared, was removed from House Bill 2 for the first time in 10 years. And schools applied. We had a list of 5 schools. They were ranked. Those schools were trying to get building aid. They were requesting $45 million, or their projects totaled $45 million. They were requesting $17 million in state aid for that biennium. 3 of those projects were funded. The funding amount there is there as well. $40 million was $40 million per year. Plus that 8.6 million. I'll have to look to see. I'm a little rusty apparently. The total projects for that was 8.6 million. We'll see on a chart on the next page. So in that, keep in mind that 5 projects, a lot of people would have asked, why did only 5 schools apply? When you had this 10-year moratorium, why didn't you have more schools apply? Well, you have to apply for building aid a year ahead of time. And we were in a moratorium, and I'm pretty sure most of the schools that applied really were very surprised that they got building aid. And so you can see building aid was lifted, and in 2022 and 2023, that biennium, we had 12 schools apply. Now, what's interesting is you have to apply. Keep in mind, fiscal 22 actually starts in 2021, right? July 1st of 2021. You have to apply a year in advance. So now we're talking about July of 2020. So now we're deep in a pandemic. So now the moratorium has been lifted, but we have schools applying during the pandemic. So again, 12 schools did apply. We had in January, so January of 2020, pre-pandemic, sort of, January 2020, there's part of the law requires you to notify the Department of Education if you're going to apply. It's called the letter of intent. We had 50 schools in January of 2020 tell us that they were going to apply for building aid. By the time the application process rolled around, which was July of 2020, much, much different, schools were doing lots of things other than applying for building aid, and 12 schools put in applications. So just again, thinking about this list isn't necessarily a perfect snapshot of who would be applying for building aid. And then this biennium coming, we had 17 schools apply, and they applied last year. They were ranked, and we just realized that of those 17 schools, the budget includes enough to fund 3 of them. I put TBD there, but I guess we will soon have a signature and no. So, but it looks like 3 schools will receive funding through that process. And the only other thing I'll mention, I think that's important to note, is that in 2023, in the middle of the moratorium, because the moratorium starts in 2010, in 2013, the law drastically changes. It says there was a big revision of the law, and it said we're no longer going to fund projects on demand. Well, on demand meaning we're no longer going to fund all the projects. Instead, we're going to make it a competitive process. We're going to cap building aid at $50 million. We were also at that time in 2010 spending about $60 million a year in building aid. So at that time, there was a cap put on of $50 million in building aid. And what happens when you have a cap is it now becomes a competitive process. And so now, in order to figure out who gets that money, there's a whole ranking process that's involved. And you mentioned some of those, the security, unsafe conditions, either structural issues, mechanical issues, plumbing issues, educational space, suitability issues, overcrowding, consolidation, all of those things that you now get points for, which leads to one of the biggest problems of that ranking is that you get all these points for really big projects, right? So if you wanted to put in, let's say, a security vestibule, or if you wanted to add an addition to expand a program, those smaller projects are hard to get building aid for because you're not checking all of those boxes like a brand new school would. Or if you're consolidating schools, those projects also score really high as well. Not that those aren't worthy projects, but that is kind of what flushes out is all those new schools or consolidation projects float to the top, and some of the smaller projects don't. And the next page is really just the rates. If you were thinking about like what rates does my areas have, my towns have, those are the rates right there, the building aid rates. And then this graph, especially because if you're thinking about funding it differently, one of the items on your list was whether you want to think about continuing that 80% model or paying over the tail. I didn't really talk about that much, but prior to 2013, if you recall, I said the law changed drastically. Prior to 2013, the state paid on the term of the bond. So if you got a $10 million award and you were a 20-year bond, you would get $500,000 every year for 20 years. In 2013, that changed. You already mentioned it. And now you get the award up front. You get 80% of your award prior to construction, 20% upon completion. So we're done paying within 2 to 3 years or however long it takes for the project. So when you hear the word tail, this is what they're talking about. I suppose it does look like a tail. This tail is the obligated payments on those bond payments we were making prior to 2000 for projects prior to 2013, which really are projects prior to 2010, since we didn't fund anything from 2010 to 2013. You can see it goes all the way out to 2041. That's actually a 30-year bond that didn't start until 2011. Those were a couple of the final schools that were applied in 2009, and by the time they got their financing. So that's where those 2041. So in 2041, the tail will be gone unless the law changes and adds a new tail. So with that, I feel like that's a quick summary. If there's anything else you want me to hit specifically on the summary piece of things.
Okay, are there any questions? Yes, or need from further information?
Yeah,
Yes.
just looking at the chart on your summary page, I'm interested in 2022-23. You said that there were 12 applications for new projects and 2 were funded. Is that correct?
2 were funded, that's correct.
Now, did that 2 that were funded, did that take up the available funding that was in the budget at that time?
It did. If you actually, if you look on that graph as well, that was 22-23. What interestingly, if you look on this graph of 22 and 23, those solid bars are the tail obligated payments. The state also took out a bond in 2010 to meet a shortfall that they had, so that there's the bond payment as well on there. But the dashed lines are the new project payments. And so in 22 and 23, so 22 and 23, the state actually stacked the appropriation from, and you can see in 2023, no money. So this current year, we were given no money for building aid. Instead, they paid extra in 2022. So that 30 million went to those two projects. And actually one project was fully funded and the second project was, the second project, I'm going to guess we shorted them about $7 million from there. So it didn't pay for a full two projects.
So on a follow-up to that, Amy, so that meant that then the state board makes these decisions, they make this allocation, correct?
No, the legislature does.
We make that decision.
So the decision to fund just two at the rate that you just indicated was made rather than funding smaller amounts to more applications, is that correct?
Yes and no. All the projects, those 12 projects that come in, the law requires that the Department of Education, the State Board of Education rank those projects. If the small projects ranked high because they scored lots of points, they just get picked off from the top of the list. The first ranked project actually wasn't selected because they didn't pass their warrant article. So the next project passed their warrant article, so we gave funding to them. Does that answer your question? Yeah, until we run out of money. So we picked a project off, paid for it. Who else passed their warrant article? Yep, you did, offered the money. And then the second project we offered to actually wanted more, but we only had whatever remaining we had for them. Yep.
So maybe you can explain this to the group. So a number of schools obviously did not receive funding this year or in the previous go around as well, beyond the two or the three. Now, if you're one that didn't receive, for example, let's take Concord this year. So their project for the state cost was roughly what, around, as I think around, recall, $70 million thereabouts. And that would just kind of wipe out our entire account for funding that school in its entirety. But if a school doesn't receive in a given year, are they automatically put on the list at the top, or they have to compete against with all those other projects that are coming in and they're reprioritized? How's it work?
Okay, so these questions are going to get a little complicated because House Bill 452 was signed into law last month. So the process is now a little different than the folks that are that are on the list right now. And so the department still needs to make some rules on that. Literally just passed maybe 3 weeks ago. But the law used to read, I'll try to say what it used to say last month was that if you didn't get funding, if you passed your warrant article, but the state didn't have money, you could stay on the list for the next biennium. But the problem with that is, you're not going to get money if you're project number 11. So why would you even ask your voters for a vote? You're just wasting time. So House Bill 452 corrects that. I hope that it will correct it anyway. I have to get down in the nitty gritty to it, but and some of that will come with rulemaking. But the new process will be that you get to stay on the list regardless of the vote. Even if you had a failed vote, you get to stay on the list for so many years. 3 years, 4 years. I think that's going to be determined by rulemaking.
I thought 452, they could get bumped if there's a project that came in with some of those needs such as safety, et cetera.
Yes, absolutely. You are correct. So if you are a project, there is one way you can get bumped, and is if you apply and you have higher life safety points, you have to score more than half of the points, and you have to have more points than people that are above you that were on the list prior, then you can jump to the top of the ranking. So now this new process kind of creates this waiting line, and it'll be interesting to see how long that line gets.
Representative Cascade and then Representative Woodcock.
What are the list of schools on page 9, 10, and 11? Have they already applied?
Yes, that's a good question. So this is the fiscal 24 and 25. This is our list for this year. You know how I said they have to apply a year ahead of time? These are the schools that applied for this coming budget. And the budget has passed with enough funds, not that they'll get funding, but enough funds to cover the top 3 projects. We know Rochester is prepared to take funds, and we know Monadnock has passed their warrant article. Colebrook failed, but they'll get one other opportunity to do so because it's a biennium list. And if they pass next year, then those would be their awards.
Just staying on the list, because I know they didn't pass their warrant.
Correct. Yep. And that would be the case for everybody's. This is a biennium list. So next year, the list doesn't change. Nobody adds to it. Nobody can apply for building aid. It's different with the new law. So the next 2 years, the list will have different rules to play on, but.
What about the list of schools on page 9, 10, 11?
So, now 9, 10, and 11, and I apologize if that was your original question. Okay. Not page 9, 10, and 11. Those are those obligated payments. Those are our projects that we're still paying on that were constructed prior to 2010. Those are what we call our tail payments. And so every year that list gets shorter and shorter because we pay on the term of the bond. So every year a handful of those fall off because they made their last bond payment. And that's what allows that 50 million to grow. So in theory, in 2013, the theory was that you'd pay off that tail. Once it's paid off, you'll have a consistent 50 million per year to spend. Now, 50 million is a lot different than it was in 2009 than it is now, but that was the thinking, I believe.
So if they're on this list, they're receiving payment for previous projects, can they still apply for a new project?
Yes, that's,
That's
yep.
I asked because I submitted a letter of intent. Now that's 2 years in the past. I know they're still somewhere in the wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if they start the process all over again, or if they can even move forward with what's being paid out.
Yeah, so everybody that's not on the list of 17, this 24, 25 list, that's all of the people that are on the list right now. Anybody who's not will need to apply for building aid if they're interested. There's no other list. However, this list of payments, that doesn't preclude people from applying for building aid. Just because Littleton or any other district got building aid, they can still apply for another school or for another project. But what building aid does, it's also important to remember that everybody is playing by the same set of rules. So even Concord, I know people don't always want to think so, but when they're requesting, I realize this isn't your question, but when they're requesting 76 million, that doesn't mean that they're eligible for if they're requesting 76 million, it's important to remember that doesn't mean that they're eligible for 76 million. They are eligible per square footage, per student, cost per square foot, the same as any other project. So with that said, there is a caveat in building aid is that we are not going to pay for space that was just touched and paid for with building aid in the past 40 years. I think the rule actually says 35 years. So the thought was they could apply in 35 years. By the time they're actually constructing, it would be 40 years. So essentially, the goal is to not be paying for a space that received building aid in the last 40 years. So anybody on this list for a very specific project, I happen to be at the top of the list. Amherst, they did a renovation for these particular spaces. We have on record, you don't see it here, but we have on record on our end how much square footage that those schools worked on. Those areas are prohibited from receiving building aid again for 40 years. And if they wanted to take those schools and if they wanted to take those spaces and move to a brand new building, we would allow them to do that, but we would deem all of those square footages ineligible for building aid. Their spaces would essentially be prorated. So they could still move, we just wouldn't pay for those spaces for the new construction piece of it. With the thought that the buildings that they're building should be lasting at least 40 years.
Representative Woodcock.
I understood this a minute ago, so. Going back, and stop me if you said it, I just didn't get it, I'll figure it out later. If a school was on the initial eligible list, didn't make it, and they're still there, and they were ranked, say, number 8. And then in the new process, the new 400 legislation coming in, they have to reapply again, or they carry over, they stay at number 8. I guess my question is, does their ranking drop because new school applications been ranked higher, but they were 8th before, now they dropped to 18th, or do they still stay at 8th and everything else goes below them?
They now still stay at 8th unless a new school applies and they have scored more than half the life safety points, and they have more life safety points than the people on the list, then they can jump. So you have to score a lot of life safety. They're actually called unsafe condition points. You have to score more than half of them. And if you score more than half of them, that you're unsafe and you can jump number 8 all the way to somebody else who doesn't have as many life safety points as you do, or unsafe condition points.
Just like, so taking that one point, then, the life safety points as you scale your applications, that would be the most critical part of the application.
Correct. I think it's 1,000 points they can score, and I think the unsafe condition is either 250 or 300 points.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now you know how to score your
I'm
application.
lost.
Oh,
And just for a clarifying question, just to clarify, in the case of Littleton applied for an intent to fund, but they didn't file an actual application, so they were never ranked. And that was similar with many people who applied during that time. And I know that they are getting ready to apply again.
is that for their elementary school? The two-story building? Yeah, okay.
Yep. And it is also important, like, that's really important that when you're thinking about a new process, that building a new school is a long process. It's not something that you can just all of a sudden be like, we need to, there's a lot of vetting what the community wants. It's a really long process.
When you talk about, you corrected me once when we were doing the 452, or, there, and I was using the wrong figure for square feet per pupil. I was using just solely the classroom figure. I think that's around $300 per pupil, roughly.
So
What is it for the entire facility with everything else?
yeah, it's about 150. Well, it varies, but it varies. High school, elementary, big school, little school, but in general, it's about 150 square feet per student.
For the entire facility, or is on top of the classroom space?
No, for the entire facility.
150 square feet.
Yeah, you could take the enrollment of any school, multiply it by 150 square feet per student, and you would get their approximate size. Now, you would get the approximate size that would be eligible for building aid.
Okay.
More so, schools are probably building closer to 180 square feet per student. Some schools are even up to 200 square feet per student. Special education spaces drive that. Some schools have really strong, let's just say, music programs, and so they have an orchestra room and a violin room. Those spaces those are above and beyond. Awesome that they have those spaces. They're just not qualify for those minimums. Special education spaces are certainly something that this committee might want to, or at least for rulemaking anyway, we'll be taking a look at. I guess it's actually outside the law, but is those special education spaces what those needs are in schools?
So I'm a little bit confused. You're saying, I had on this sheet right here, 144 square feet.
That's about right. Yep.
But what is the cost of that square foot?
Yeah, that cost of that square footage is Right now, we're running at about $550 a square foot. So I think, so we also cap construction costs, and that's where I think the difference was between your numbers and mine. So construction costs are capped. We track the costs that a public school project uses or submits receipts for, and then we cap those based on a national standard indexed to New Hampshire, even indexed down to the county. And so those are about construction. We're talking about envelope, actual construction of the building. That's about, varies, but about $220 a square foot. And that doesn't include engineering fees, architect fees, site development, furniture, fixtures, equipment, things like that. I mean, it doesn't include an elevator if you had an elevator in your building, so things like that.
Yes, Representative Cascadden.
Follow up on the list you were just saying, land acquisition?
Correct. Now, it's eligible for building aid, which is what that $550 per square foot is. We just have a cap very specific on construction costs. But there are caps on land too. It's just, it's done per acre, and at the rate, the market value rate. It's hard to do that. Manchester's property is much different than, and you can't really cap it by county. So it's really what the market value is. And then we allow so many acres per student. You can, it is eligible for building aid, correct. Yep.
Are these national standards you're talking about?
Correct. National construction standards. It's industry wide. The manuals that they put out, you can look them up by hospital. You can look them up by gas station, elementary school, middle school, high school. It's RS means. It's a national standard.
Yes, Representative Myler, and then Representative Luna.
I'm not, if I may focus on charter schools for a moment,
Sure, yeah.
you may not be able to answer this.
And I have Tal Bear is here too. He's a charter school administrator from the Department of Education.
Let me give you a scenario and see if you can respond. Charter schools get started with a grant of, let's say, $1 million from the federal government. There's some private money that comes in to help start that school. They want to purchase a building. So the combination of the startup fees, private fees, and let's say in this instance, even some state money that we give them. They purchase a building, they renovate the building, and they get it ready for school. They take out a mortgage. And at the end of the third year, let's say, there still is a mortgage on the building. They've got assets in the building, et cetera. And the charter school decides that we're going to end our charter school.
Mm.
What happens to the assets of that charter school? Where does it go? I'm assuming the charter school is a 501c3. There's some legal issues there. But the question would be, particularly as we begin to look at state contributions as well as federal contributions, you're creating this asset now. We've got a building here. School's now going to be gone. What happens to that asset? Who's responsible for the mortgage of it that's still outstanding, as well as the assets that have been put in from the federal government and the state government in this issue? Well, what happens to that asset at that point?
Yeah, I'll let Tal come on up, and then I guess I'll just point out from the building aid perspective, I can talk a little bit more about that part of it. But on building aid does have a requirement, a penalty. It requires the school pay back the full amount of the award if they change uses in 20 years. I realize your question is more about how you get that money. So there is a requirement for schools, public schools, anybody who applies for building aid receives building aid to pay it back if they change uses within the 20-year period. Then I do believe Representative Mooney's bill did have some proposal for that dissolution process.
Before you respond, if there's federal monies involved in that, how does that, I understand the state money and reimbursement.
Yeah.
How does the federal money fit into that?
Yep, so for all our applications, what we do is when they fill out their application, there's a couple application processes that they go through. They make estimates during the initial period, but then in the final, when they're getting ready to get that last 20% of their award or their final payment, they have to submit a full statement of all of their all of their statements. And on that, we subtract out any kind of federal funding that they receive. So building aid is paid on so if you think about the project total, and then we subtract out the federal portion that they get and pay state aid based on the remaining portion of it.
We changed that. Remember, where the grant, if for example, it was Colebrook which generated that concern from Superintendent Taylor, the state and grant money is taken out. They can use the gift money.
But they can use for their local match. So if you're thinking about the state match and then the local match,
Yeah.
federal dollars you cannot use for your local match. You can now, with the passage of 452, use gifts, donations for your local match. But federal dollars you cannot. So it comes off the top. They can't use it for their local share portion of it.
Dave, did you have?
Yeah, he's got. No, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Tal Bear with the Charter School Office, and hopefully I will not confuse this issue any more than it appears it might be. It's a complicated answer because it really depends on where the funds come from specific to the charter school. So if you've got restricted donations to a charter school, if it dissolves, then those restrictions would come into play. If they're federal funds that were used in the operation of that charter school, then you're going to be dealing with federal guidelines, and then depending on the amounts of those funds or items or assets, it kind of drives it in a different direction than into the state funds. That's a whole nother kettle of fish. So I do think it's a more complicated issue than just simply they're dissolving. What happens? And then lastly, I would add, I would assume if you have a bank, they're the lien holder on the property. I would assume that the bank would be the owner of that property and would have, depending, I'd be shocked if they would do some kind of first, I forget the legal term, but where I used to be in mortgage banking, and you were always the first lien holder. And if the loan ever failed, we always got our money back first. So I don't know how that works at least here in New Hampshire. I just know back home that was kind of how we operated.
Just as a follow-up, so based upon what you're saying, there needs to be some clarification on how that's going to be handled.
I do think there should be some clarification.
The other question I have then, how many charter schools currently own their own facility?
Of the 32 schools, there are 7.
And just along the same lines, just pointing out that the draft bill also included a different payment schedule. Again, the bill, well, you guys are talking about it today, so obviously that's why it's here. But the payment in the bill talks about breaking up payments, not giving it all up front and then paying upon completion. Instead, it's giving 20% of it every year for 5 years. I think that was another way to make sure that the state held on to some of that money under that same concern.
Can I add something? I just would also add something for consideration. We're not talking about school buildings the size of traditional school buildings. Many of these charter schools could be, 300 to $500,000. If we have charter schools with $3 to $5 million buildings, that's kind of a rare exception. Most of their buildings are fairly small.
Amy, how does a charter conversion school work into this? If I'm a public school district and I say, I'm going to become a charter conversion school, my school board is still there, it's owned by the municipality. How's that work in conjunction with this law?
So under building aid, the school district can just apply for building aid because they're the owners. If I'm understanding your question right, the school district can still apply for building aid for those district spaces.
So the school board no longer has a regular public school. It has a public charter conversion school.
I guess I'm not
The school board has a district-approved charter, which it's a separate process. that they would essentially get their charter approved through their local district and their town process. Once that's completed, then the state does the final sign off. But it would be a separate process.
And I'd have to relook at 194B, but I believe so again, building aid is set up to allow charter schools to apply for aid. It's 194B in the charter school law that prevents them from applying, but I do believe 194B allows district conversion schools to apply for building aid. Do we have any of those?
No, you
No,
don't. They've
we don't.
closed
So
down.
we've always just said, oh, they're not eligible because there's none available. But if it was that type of charter school, then they would be able to apply for building aid under the current law.
Yes, Representative Cordelli, and then Representative Luna.
Thank you, Mr. Beer.
Oh, you didn't. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I think maybe last term, the application process for a charter school was revised so that it had to include a dissolution plan if they owned their own building. Is part one, is that correct?
Partially. All of them have to include a dissolution plan regardless of building ownership.
And follow up, if I might.
Yes, go ahead.
I think in this bill, there is a provision so that if a building is improved or constructed during the period, that they have to have that plan in place. But it should already be there as part of their application process. Is that correct?
Correct.
Representative Luna?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Going back to Representative Myler's question, and I think also what Representative Cordelli was also, referencing to. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the clawback policy works in the event a school that has received building aid as part of its construction or renovation costs it's been determined that it's being used for something else. If you could just sort of lead us through how that works, how many times this has happened maybe before, and what we can expect.
It has happened. I'm familiar with at least 3, if not more, cases where it's happened. The law says that the penalty is paid back, but there's some discretion at the commissioner's level, at the Department of Education's level. And what the department did at that time is that we just prorated. So one of the schools closed at like 18 years. And so essentially we just did it. So keep in mind that we used to pay on the term of the bond. So it was much easier under that old model to just say, well, you're closing, we're not going to pay any more building aid. We don't actually have to get any money back from them. We just stopped paying them.
Right.
In all 3 cases, we did that. In all 3 cases, they were at the very end of their time. And then, of course, a lot of times, your elementary school in Berlin just closed. I think that might have been one of them that had, had done some small work. It would be really difficult in that situation to be like, oh, pay that $5 million back.
Right.
So in that case, we just stopped payment. And it is a good thought for this group now thinking about what happens if we're giving all of that money up front, that 80% up front and 20% upon completion. It's definitely a lot more difficult to get money back.
So, and a follow-up on that. So would a change of use include the building being used for a school district and then maybe the building being used for some other operating entity as a school? Would that be a change of use if there was a change of ownership?
Change of ownership. So, you know, if you had a school that was then turned over to the YMCA and now they're operating it, yeah, that would not be we wouldn't pay for YMCA spaces.
So that would be a change of use.
That would be a change of use, yeah.
And
Yep, you could have a school, you could have a K through 12 school that turns it into an SAU office, and that also would not be, that would also require them to pay it back, because it's for 12, the law says that it's for K through 12 education. You know, so if they turn it into an SAU office, that they would be required to turn that money back over.
okay, and you'd mentioned that in your experience, the few times this has happened, it's been towards the tail end of a 20-year thing where you know, a lot of people's crystal balls don't go out necessarily 20
Correct.
years.
Yeah.
And we can sort of see that happening. But have you seen any changes of use or district failures in the first, you know, few years, you know, 1, 2, 3 years after a building was either constructed or substantially renovated?
I have not, no. And I do know that sometimes I get calls from schools saying, oh, well, we were thinking about changing the space to a preschool space, which is not an eligible building aid cost. And then they find out that that puts them in jeopardy of having to pay their building aid back. And they're like, oh, that's not a good space for preschool then. It's really pretty easy for decision at that point. They can request a waiver, you know, consideration from the department. The law does allow that. To shifting spaces, and something like a preschool might make sense. We always tell the districts, if it makes sense, approach us, because you know we want to make some good decisions for the district. But they are wise to make that call, because the law does say K through 12 education.
Great, thank you, Amy.
Yes, Representative Dry, and then Representative Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to 194B11, we talked about there will be no school building aid awarded to a chartered public school, but there's that clause at the end of the sentence that says, unless the building is owned by the school district under lease to the chartered public school, and such lease does not include an option to purchase the building. This is different than a charter conversion school, is that correct?
Do you want? I don't know. The way when I've read that before. Is that I have always been, that is when the school district owns that space and the charter school is leasing that space. Is that also a conversion school?
That is,
No, okay.
That's just simply a tennis.
So for me, that law has always been confusing to me, because I'm like, it wouldn't be the charter school that would be applying for it anyway. It would be the school district. So they could apply for those spaces.
And follow up?
Yep.
Are there schools that fit that unless clause in operation now?
I don't believe so. Do you?
There are some charter schools that lease from public schools. Here, I can think of two offhand.
One more follow-up? So then they would be eligible to apply for building aid?
They, the charter school or the district?
That's a good question.
Yeah, like I read it, it sounds like the district, but I'm not an attorney, so.
So we have always said it would be the school district that would apply, because the charter schools are eligible for lease aid. So it's maybe it's not that well written, but we have always said it would be the school district. They're leasing from the school district, so it would be receiving an application from the school district, not the charter school,
Building owner. Yeah.
the building owner.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question, to go back to your dissolution of child school property. You said that in the DOE, I think what you said, was in the DOE application, that process is identified? Or what the dissolution process is going to be if they have to dissolve?
Yeah, the language is they must have a dissolution plan as part of their charter application. Each plan could be slightly different, depending on the organization, but they have to have a plan, yes.
Okay, follow? Thank you. So to that then, are those plans public information?
I assume they would be because they're part of the charter application.
And the charter application is public information?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
And does the department have copies of that charter application?
We do.
Okay, I'm looking at another section law, 194B16. And section Roman 7, if a school's charter expires or is revoked, the school shall be dissolved under the provisions of its charter application and contract. If the contract provisions are silent or ambiguous as to the disposition of any asset of the school. Do you have any charters that still have that ambiguous language that may have required this to be written that would cause some issues in terms of the disposition of assets of the school?
At this time, I'm not sure.
Further questions? Amy, I have one for you. It's jumping off the charter school a little bit. When we look at all these 17 applications which we received, there's some that are large and some that are smaller. I know there's some states which have several pots of money available. One for, well, maybe one for leasing, one for possibly, I'll take a figure, $5 million less or $3 million less, and then those for the larger ones. My concern is that when we get to some of these large projects, and they're going to come at us, we could end up funding just one project in a period of, well, right now, in a period of 2 years, seeing the tail is taking half of what we appropriate. So do you know of any states where it may be working where they have several pots of money where we can allocate resources out depending upon the size of the application?
I'm not sure. I know that some have different pots of money for different types of projects. So like if you were going to do a window project or a door replacement project, so that makes those projects smaller.
You're talking about renovation.
Yeah, renovation. But keep in mind for building aid, you definitely wouldn't want to make a pot for renovation and a pot for new, because the renovations, when we talk about a renovation, we're talking about open studs and just doing a full renovation. The law defines it as substantial renovation. So you're really bringing up that space up to new. Oftentimes those types of renovation projects cost just as much, sometimes even more than a new build. I think if you are wanting to reach more people, if you're doing that, to me that says that you want to reach more people with the money, because a lot of these brand new buildings or new builds are because the building itself is in really bad condition, and so it's not that isn't where the money should focus on, because those are like your worst buildings usually. But if you're interested in pushing money out to reach more people, which I can see that would be a big benefit as well, you may want to consider how we operate lease aid. Well, how we operate lease aid is people apply for lease aid and we fund everybody on the list. And that way you're not ranking these projects. I think that is a good thing for you all to look at, is like those 17 projects come in, we get an appropriation, and you can still prorate people, you can still grant them an award based on more affluent, less affluent, maybe even give them more percentage points for the types of projects that you want to float to have more importance, and then you could just prorate everybody across the list. That way, everybody is getting a share of whatever was appropriated. For me, that solves a couple of problems. It solves the big problem of schools not feeling like they have to rush and get a big project in. They could do projects in pieces a lot better. They could do phasing of a project a lot better. They could do smaller projects a lot better. And the department wouldn't be ranking these projects so that it would allow everybody to compete on a level playing field. It also, legislatively, doesn't give focus onto only those that are receiving the aid that are at the top. And I feel like if you've got a list that everybody it's not all about who's on the list anymore. It's just a matter of those are the people that are going to get aid. The problem with that, because I have thought this through, the problem with that is you never know how much you're going to get, and you don't know how many people are going to apply. So one year you might be prorating it 80, everybody gets 80% of what the formula shakes out to be, and other years you might be like, oh, you're only going to get 30% of whatever the formula shakes out to be. In Lease Aid, that happened. In Lease Aid, one year we gave everybody like 44% of what they were asking for. The following year, the legislature bumped that amount up. And so it gives a better, in my opinion, it gives a better picture of what the real ask is. The real ask is this amount. And schools could still reject that award. Like, it'd be like, oh, I can't do it if the state's only going to give me 30% of what I'm asking for. They could just wait and apply later. You know, I think that could, something I hope that you consider of during this time.
And one other question I have, I'm trying to dig down in my memory here and define renovation. Somehow 25% of the cost of construction rings a bell, but I'm not sure. Where's the breakoff between maintenance and renovation?
I think what you're referring to is that in the law, there is a requirement, the definition of substantial renovation is your project has to be at least a renovation project of at least $5 million or 25% of what it would cost to build a new building. That law was in there just for those smaller projects to say, well, $5 million might be a lot for what the little schools. So maybe they have to meet something smaller. So it's 25% of whatever is new. That would define a substantial renovation. Maintenance, we think of maintenance as things that you can prepare for and you can put in your regular school budget, such as window replacements, roof replacements that aren't big capital construction projects. They're expensive, and building aid used to pay for them, but those are considered like more some people call them renovation because they're replacing their windows, but in our world, we'd call that maintenance.
Further questions? Okay, I got one last one here. Sorry to everybody else, but we had a proposal that came forward and everybody has a copy of that amendment. It's the back of the packet that was handed out. It was amendment 967H. I won't say any names. This amendment dealt with another way of paying for classroom space, and it would be an annual commitment of dollars to these districts. We talked about this in finance. $300 for each pupil in the municipality's ADMR in grades kindergarten through grade 8, $350 for each pupil in the municipality's ADMR in grades 9 through 12. Can you comment on that approach of giving this blanket amount annually to the schools for them to put into a fund which is only usable for, if we don't change it, for construction of a new construction renovation? First, what we're doing. What are some of the shortcomings? What are some of the positives of it?
Well, I think definitely the positive of it is it just gives everybody some money to allocate to what it might cost them, right? So for somebody who just built something, that's great because they're going to get some extra money that they probably never think that they're ever going to see anyway. It just essentially distributes money, cost per pupil, to school districts. The biggest problem is that I think this is designed so that you collect a little bit of money each year per student and you are responsible and save it, which in the ideal world, I think that that's a great option. But if that was in place 50 years ago and there was some restrictions on it, then 50 years now we would have some money. So unless somebody's willing to put in my estimates is about $10 billion into an account so that people can start getting the savings that they should have had 50 years ago per pupil throughout the life of the account, then I guess that's the shortcoming. The shortcoming is that there's no money right now for people to do construction projects, and there won't be for 40 years, the way that House bill is written. I'm sure there are good things about it as well.
Yeah, just going to say, I'm from Washington DC, and back home we have a similar program. And this has been a few years, but each charter school essentially has a facilities credit per year per student. It used to be in the $1,500 to $2,000 range, and then those credits saved up each year actually became the down payment for many of those charter schools to purchase buildings. And then also maintain the existing facility they were in. That became a springboard for building ownership for charter schools, which if you were to look at a charter school, the two biggest expenses they have are typically lease and salary. Many of them can never get out of the cycle of purchasing a building because they can't save enough money to buy a building. So those lease credits, those facilities credits served a purpose, and they allowed charter schools to accumulate enough money to acquire a down payment so they could eventually buy a building. So it works in other states.
And I'd say if the state were to move forward with this, then it might run well in tandem with a program so that it's ready in 40 years to be used. And it doesn't have to be 40 years. I mean, people could cash in their credits. I would also use them as credits so that money just doesn't kind of disappear. But somebody might want to tap into it in 20 years for time and use it at that time.
Should if we venture down this road, do you think it's fair to say that all K through 8s are going to get $300, all high schools are going to get $350, or should there be other criteria that come into the mix, such as property wealth or isolation or demographic?
That I think that's 100% a policy question. I mean, that's not, the Department of Education really doesn't have a role in that. I think whatever you all decide of where that money should be distributed, my hope is that you come up with a process that will allow schools to have a functioning and probably even more importantly, a way to plan, like what is there, what can they plan for? If it's 10%, it's 10%. If it's 40%, it's 40%. But and if it's nothing, it's nothing. But I think some kind of process that schools can work with is really important. I'm sure if school was sitting here, they would be like, oh, 0% is not okay. So maybe I should take that back a little bit, but I think it will be really helpful for right now. Building aid is just really volatile. It's like some money, no money, maybe some money, maybe enough for one school, maybe enough for 3 schools. It's a little bit of a roller coaster because that cap is a maximum cap, not a minimum cap. And I don't know, sometimes I wonder if there should even be a cap. I don't know if it hinders or at all, but versus changing it to a minimum or a maximum, I don't know. I don't know, that money thing is hard because money's hard to dedicate, so. That's your job.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, just along those same lines. So, clearly, I think the intent of building aid is to provide a fiscal capacity, access to resources, particularly for districts that don't have it, and you sort of see that in the 30-60 window. But I was wondering, could you say again what that tax, the facility credit amount is in DC?
Again, this would have been a decade or more ago, but it was somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 on facilities. I don't know if they've changed it or if it had graduating amounts. We had a building of 50,000 square feet, and I remember that number as our set facilities credit amount per student.
Okay, I mean, that's almost 10 times what was proposed in the HB2 amendment on a per capita per student basis. And is there a way that we could get maybe a summary of if that program's still going on?
I could reach out to my counterparts in the district.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting to look at just as a comparison, whether that's used on a charter basis, a public school basis. I mean, it's,
Absolutely.
Going back to Washington DC, in Kentucky, they're required, they sort of a similar program, but they also have what they call first nickel. And that means that the district has to put some money in the kitty before they're going to collect their credits. So there's sort of kind of some ownership in this. Would anything like that be existing in Washington where you came from? Or
Not that I'm aware of, but I'll actually do a little bit of digging both in Washington DC, but also reach out to the National Charter School Resource Center and see what other states are doing
That'd be great.
with this specific issue.
Thank you.
And Rick, on that very issue, I think that's very interesting because, it's getting us out of the first and last dollar into the last dollar. State funding comes in to get you the rest of the way.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a model for building.
Jen, can you do some research with us, please, and get us all that information? You gave me, you funneled some information about Kentucky to me. Can you hit all those links and try and, thank you. And with the Education Commission of the States, I think that's where you got it. Yep. Further questions? Any further need from the department?
We always do.
I know it. Amy, you have, I know you have thoughts on the lease program and some of these other ventures as far as funding, building aid. Do you think you could put some of that together for us? Because we want to look at this thing seriously and figure out how we can support both the charters and how we can support the public schools that are needing this aid with the limited dollar we have. It's still, we will be losing this tail here shortly in about another 5 years or so, a good part of the tail. So that means there's going to be a lot more than just $50 million available per year, maybe as much as $75, $80 million. So that's something to look forward. But
Yep, happy to do that.
thank you very much. Further questions? Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Is there any more discussion from the committee on this? We'll get some of this research in, and what we hope to do is come back in the fall. We're not going to be meeting during the months of July and August, but we will come back, and school building aid will be a topic which we address in September. So we'll meet then at the call of the chair.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else for today?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Sure, we're open.
If you look at,
Yeah.
after 19,
Yeah, see, it
30,
it really
it's
gives down, doesn't it?
25.8 million.
Yeah. It gets up
Pay it
at
all- Pay it
75.
off all.
Yeah,
Pay
yeah,
it all off.
yeah, be done with it. I agree.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I won't keep you very long. I know you were sort of heading out the door there and that stopped at the last minute. My name's Bob Best. I'm an attorney at Sullivan and Hollis, and I'm on the board of a couple of charter schools and also on the board of a New Hampshire Charter School Foundation, which is sort of intended to be a organization that brings together some of the knowledge base that different charter schools have gained over the years to help some of the newer, younger charter schools get their feet under them very well. And I'd just like to offer up whatever answers or discussion that can be had on behalf of charter schools to some of the questions that you had about how the building works or what happens if a charter school fails and in its building and that sort of thing. Some of those things are outlined already in statute pretty well, and we just point out where they are for you. I think the discussion earlier today seems to suggest that there's a lot going on with building aid, and it's not just about including charter schools. It seems like there's lots of moving pieces. And I hope that however that progresses, that charter schools just remain sort of part of that discussion and involved in whatever that solution is, so that we could have the opportunity to participate in that aid going forward. That said, I know there's a lot of questions about how many schools own their buildings and why, and what that history might have been, and what happens to buildings when charter schools go up or down. Didn't have to be a discussion today. I know that you guys have had kind of a full discussion already, but in the future, when you come back in the fall, we'll certainly come visit again and be available to you, or you could reach out to me or to the New Hampshire Charter School Foundation, and we could supply any written information you'd want in the interim. And we'd glad to be a resource for you.
Do you have a business card you can share with the committee?
Oh, let's see. Probably do.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, it's my business from the law firm. It's not from the foundations or the charter schools, but I can.
Got a phone number on there, right?
You got it. It does.
Great.
Anything else, Jen? Okay. Anything
We got a question for you too.
Okay. Here's some more. Yeah. Okay.
Give us a little history of some of those that maybe a family. Probably, somewhere in the information is all together.
I think
About the schools that have not succeeded.
Oh, we got this, haven't we? 32, 7.
Sure. I don't have anything like that prepared, but I'd be happy to work with Tal on that. I think he's got a lot of the resources, and we'd certainly help poll the charter schools to find out what they've been doing and how they've been doing with things. I haven't, fortunately, knock on wood, been involved with any of the schools that have not succeeded, so I don't know what the circumstances were that led them to that. I know that historically the statute in New Hampshire that authorizes charter schools originally didn't allow any debt by the charter schools, and then that was amended. But in the beginning, that's why most charter schools don't own their buildings, because they weren't allowed to have any debt. And then when that was changed, then you can have debt and borrow and buy buildings, but the lease aid was a strong motivator to stay in the rental market, and so a lot of charter schools did that. And that's why I think the number, I was surprised that Tal said it was 7. I thought it was more like 2 or 3 that own their buildings. It's growing because it's becoming more viable, but for a long time, the playing field was tilted towards renting. And that's why there's so many that rent their spaces and not own them. Sure thing.
Thank you very much. Anything else? It's BEST?
That's right.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Best. And what we're going to do is we're going to break till September, but in the interim, we're going to be doing research, so we may be giving you a jingle, if you
Wonderful.
don't mind.
Absolutely, anytime.
Thank you. The same for Tal and Amy. Thank you all very much. Is there anything else for the committee today? Yes.
Comment about my availability in September is like 0 to none. That I can meet on subcommittees after the RAND trial is done, like the second week of October. So
Okay,
if you want to consider that,
okay, thank you.
yeah.
And if you are unable, you might want to contact Mel and let him know, and you can have a substitute come into our committee for you when you can't attend. Yep. Well, thank you very much, everybody. We are adjourned.